4BC Drive. Queensland is once again grappling with the shocking effects of domestic violence in our state as more allegations surrounding the death of Gold Coast mum Kelly Wilkinson come to light. Police have promised that internal review into their handling of the case. But did the police fail Kelly Wilkinson? Terry Goldsworthy is a criminologist, but he's also a former detective inspector who has been policing for 28 years. And Terry joins me on the line now. Terry, thanks for being on 4BC Drive.
Thanks, Scott.
I wanted to look at this from your angle as a former police officer, Terry, and also as a criminologist. I realise there's an inquiry going on, and look, I won't go through the horrific details of what happened with Kelly Wilkinson. Obviously, charges have been laid, and we all are worried about why this happened again. But from a perspective of a police officer, and you were in policing for 28 years, are domestic violence cases the most difficult to handle?
Well, I think they are, and I guess just to put it into context for your viewers, the Australian Institute of Criminology runs a program on homicide monitoring, and despite what we might see, the actual rate of intimate partner homicide, and particularly intimate partner homicide for females, is at the second lowest rate that it's been at for the last 30 years. So whilst we see these events, in actual fact, the data shows us that they have declined markedly. And Queensland's no exception to that when you look at the homicide reports from the coroners. But I looked at the comments made by the Assistant Commissioner, and I think, he touched on something which, I guess I noticed when I was in the police, where he said ultimately it's a failure that the woman had engaged with the system and were unable to prevent it from occurring. And I think that's quite true. If you look at risk factors in terms of these murders happening, failing to comply with authority and escalation of violence are two of the high leading risk factors. And if someone is motivated enough to commit an offence like this, it is very difficult for the police to stop them unless that person is incarcerated, through a denial of bail or something like that, because they basically make an assessment that the risk or the deterrence for punishment is something that is not going to stop them from committing the offence. And that is something very difficult to guard against.
Well, this is the issue. I think it's... I don't want to dismiss what's happened, and I don't want to undermine an inquiry, which I think is needed, so we can learn from it at the very least. And if there's mistakes made, we'll find out what those mistakes were. But what are the main considerations for police make when they're dealing with DVO breaches?
Well, they really are conducting what we could term, I guess, a risk assessment in relation to who's the person who's most vulnerable, who needs protection, and who is the person who is most likely to be a threat. And look, we have identified risk factors that are looking at historical intimate partner murders, etc. And, a history of domestic violence is important. Separation, actual or pending, has been highlighted as something that will often be the trigger for an escalation in violence. The use of alcohol and drugs, etc. Children will also have an impact in terms of the risk assessment. So when the police are looking at these things, they really have to look at what is the nature of the threat to the person who is the aggrieved, and what is the likelihood of the respondent or the person who's the offender in carrying out any serious threats of injury or harm.
Well, as you said, Brian Codd has admitted that police failed Kelly Wilkinson. Now, as you say, you've looked at his comments, you've looked at this case. Have you been able to identify where a failure may have occurred?
Well, look, there's a bit of, cloudiness around what offences he was facing. There were some offences going through court. We know there are amendments to the Bail Act to say that if you are facing a serious domestic violence charge, that you should not be given bail, that there is not an assumption of bail, that you need to show cause. So I guess that will be part of the inquiry, looking at were those mechanisms in place followed in terms of releasing this fellow out back into the community in regards to what threat did he pose. Did he satisfy those criteria? We have that ability to put GPS trackers on people who are on bail now, all these things. They're great. These are all great amendments. But if we're not actually enforcing them or using them, then they're of little value except for more writing on paper.
Can I ask you about, you mentioned about bail laws, and obviously we saw pass through Parliament last night these changes to juvenile laws, including the trial of tracking bracelets for 16 and 17-year-olds. And there were other parts of those changes as well in terms of a presumption against bail for those charged with serious crimes such as armed robbery and rape. But I did note that an amendment put up by the opposition didn't get up, and that was the breach of bail offence there. Now, that was an offence previously. We've heard a lot about breach of bail in terms of crimes that have been committed while out on bail. What was your thoughts in terms of a breach of bail offence? Should it have been included?
Oh, of course it should have been. I mean, it's an oxymoron to say you're going to put someone, a juvenile, on a GPS tracker, you find them down the road in breach of their curfew, etc., and there's actually no offence that you can put against them for that. So, I mean, the police will be in a position of finding Billy, who's a rampant unlawful use offender, out at night with his GPS breaching his bail, and they'll just be standing there going, well, Bill, will you hop back in the car? We'll drive you home. There's not actually a offence we can charge you with. I mean, it's ludicrous.
Well, this is what I can't work out. And I was mentioning these figures before about 400 repeat offenders were responsible for almost half of the state's youth crime. So that's a very scary statistic, repeat offenders doing that. But we know, I won't go into the specific cases because some of them are still before the courts. But clearly we have seen crimes being committed recently with allegations of murder being involved by people who are out on bail. And the fact that if someone breaches bail for serious things or even minor things, it's not an offence. That doesn't encourage anyone to keep to the bail laws.
No, well, that's right. And, we know that it's a hardcore group of youth offenders who are driving, those kind of crime waves, if you want to put it that way. Interestingly enough, the crime figures for 2019-20 were released by the government today, some 10 months after the period ended. And yet again, crime has risen in Queensland, and unlawful uses are up. The rate's up about 6%. So, we've seen a substantial rise in the homicide rate, and we've also seen a substantial rise in breach of DV offences as well. So, there are some real challenges here for the government and also, I guess, the commissioner to get on top of these issues. I mean, we've had a bit of a benefit from COVID. We saw COVID make an impact on declining crime whilst we had the lockdowns, etc., in most cases, in most crime categories. But even with that impact, we have still had an overall crime increase for that 2019-20 period in Queensland, which goes against the grain of most other states in Australia.
Terry Goldsworthy, I appreciate you being on 4BC Drive this afternoon.
Thanks, Scott.
And there it is from Terry Goldsworthy, particularly in terms of those laws passed last night, these crackdown on juvenile crime. Juvenile crime, as we know, we reported on this on 4BC, the terrible incidents we've seen in terms of young offenders out on bail. Some changes last night, as I said to Terry, a trial of tracking bracelets for 16 and 17-year-olds. But where's the breach of bail offence? Surely that should have been included in here. If you don't make it an offence to breach your bail, you do it every time. You do it every time. I'm not talking about some sort of major crime that clearly is going to get you more charges. But they say, well, you can't go out at this time of the night. You can't go to this place. That's the breach of bail. You do it anyhow. What's the worry? You're going to keep doing it. Of course you are. This was a lost opportunity last night. They should have included it. It's been in there previously. The government changed it. The Palaszczuk government got rid of breach of bail previously. They should have brought it back last night. We should have those laws in place today for breach of bail for juvenile offenders. I can't work out what this government is doing. You can see the internal divisions within government because of this. They realise that Queenslanders are sick and tired of out-of-control juvenile crime, but, in the internals of the Labor Party, within Labor's left particularly, they don't want to crack down on it. They don't want hard laws. They want soft laws. It's just not good enough. And we're going to keep seeing these crimes, and you're going to see breaches of bail and people doing the wrong things while on breaches of bail, and nothing will change. You're with Scott Emerson on 4BC Drive. Ever felt a stranger sneaking a look at your phone or laptop? Well, when you connect to public Wi-Fi, that could easily be the case. Any hacker on the same network can get access to your private information like credit card numbers, bank details and more. And even when you're at home, Australian internet providers are required by law to store logs, your metadata for at least 2 years. That's why I use ExpressVPN, and you should too. ExpressVPN is an app that encrypts 100% of my network data and reroutes it through a secure server. So my data and information stays private. whether I'm at home or on the go. And it couldn't be easier as